Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Frontline recap. I'm Philip Ingram. I present Times Radio Frontline, but also comment on all matters geopolitics, defence, security, counter-terrorism, cyber, and anything else that people ask me to do. We've got some good videos for you to have a look at this week, but all of the interviews that we've done this week are absolutely superb. So I commend you to go onto our YouTube channel and watch all of the interviews that have come on. But this week has been marked by a few significant events. The first one is Donald Trump and President Zelenskyy of Ukraine sitting down at the United Nations, and Donald Trump coming out with some interesting lines, and the relationship between them is not like we saw in the Oval Office a couple of months ago. Let's have a look at this.
This is very important. I will brief Mr. President and his team what's going on the battlefield. We have good news. Of course, we want to stop the war, and with your help, first of all. And it's good that our soldiers occupied 360 kilometers this month. And of course, we will speak about how to finish the war and about security guarantees. A lot of what to discuss. With this, during this war, we need more pressure and more sanctions. And I hope with United States, first of all, and Europe, but we support, Mr. President, your idea, and I want to discuss it, how to stop some countries from Europe, how to stop the possibility to buy Russian oil and gas.
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Your message to President Orban, who is refusing to stop buying Russian oil?
Well, he's a friend of mine. I have not spoken to him, but I have a feeling if I did, he might stop, and I think I'll be doing that. Well, the biggest progress is that the Russian economy is terrible right now. It's, as you know, it's crashing, and that, frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army.
Have you been briefed on the latest alleged drone incursions to Denmark? What do you think of that? And
Where are they?
Into Denmark, Copenhagen. Denmark is saying that there were some drones that shut down the airport, possibly Russian sabotage. What's your response to that? Will the U.S. have a material?
Well, I have no response until I find out exactly what happened. I know about it, but they haven't. They don't know what happened, but we're going to find out very soon.
Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance, but we're very strong toward NATO. NATO stepped up. When they went from 2% to 5%, that was great unity.
And here we've got Donald Trump and President Zelenskyy talking about continued support. And in this statement, Donald Trump turns around and says that Ukraine can take the territory back that Russia has captured and annexed. And he's referring back to the territory from 2014. This is a sea change in what Donald Trump's saying. Now, we always have to be slightly sceptical with Donald Trump's words because he could change his mind tomorrow. However, what he seems to be doing is increasing his support for Zelenskyy and for the Ukrainians. He seems to be happy with the United States continuing to sell weapons to European NATO nations and for them to be supplied to Ukraine. He seems to have moved away from restrictions on the use of US weapons, provided they're bought by Europe and then supplied to Ukraine. Within that, then the non-materiel support, i.e. the intelligence support and elsewhere going to Ukraine, I think is continued. My reading of it is this is Donald Trump very frustrated. I can think of another word that begins with P and second word is off, with Vladimir Putin, because I think he's beginning to realize that the one barrier to Donald Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize is Vladimir Putin. And that is frustrating Donald Trump enormously. Very positive statements coming out. It's easy to suggest that it could turn negative, but actually Donald Trump hasn't withdrawn any support or hasn't put any caveats on continued support for Ukraine, and that is probably the best we can hope for. I don't think it's going to turn into anything more materiel support. I think Donald Trump is probably stepping away and going, Europe, it's yours, you deal with it. I've had enough of this. But if having enough of this means that he's continuing with the level of support he's providing at the moment, albeit much of it paid for by European NATO nations, that's no bad thing. Europe can afford it. A real positive. Now, in response to that, our next video is quite amusing. And this is where we've got the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, speaking on RBC radio. Let's have a look at this.
Вчера между ними состоялась встреча. Разумеется, президент Трамп услышал о том, что происходит в версии Зеленского. И, по всей видимости, на этот момент эта версия и стала причиной такой оценки, которую мы слышали. И никак не тигр, все-таки больше Россия ассоциируется с медведем. Бумажных медведей не бывает. И Россия настоящий медведь. Путин неоднократно и с разными эмоциями описывал нашего медведя. Здесь вы сможете это вспомнить самостоятельно. Здесь ничего бумажного нет. Россия сохраняет свою устойчивость. Россия сохраняет макроэкономическую стабильность. Да, Россия испытывает определенные точки напряжения и проблемные точки в разных секторах экономики, что неминуемо связано и с теми мириадами экономических ограничений, санкций, с которыми мы сталкиваемся и так далее, с мировой экономической неразберихой. И президент неоднократно об этом говорил, что мы идем вперед очень аккуратно, чтобы минимизировать потери. Мы идем вперед очень аккуратно, чтобы не подорвать потенциал наш наступательный. Это очень продуманные действия. И здесь лучше растянуть их по времени, чем спешить, пытаться приурочить к чему-то какие-то победы, но при этом увеличить количество погибших.
And Peskov goes on and comments back about Donald Trump suggesting that Russia was not a paper tiger, but a paper bear. And Peskov says, no, we're a real bear. But actually, if you look at his facial expressions and his body language, Peskov is increasingly beginning to look like the old Iraqi comical Ali whenever he's in front of the cameras. He's beginning to realize that he cannot come across as being credible in any way, shape or form. Now, he does go on to say that Donald Trump still wants peace and there's still potential for negotiated settlement with all of this. But how much Peskov actually believes, I don't know. And when Peskov's wheeled out, you know that Russia is talking... I can't think of what the word is that goes with it that ends in "olux," but not necessarily talking the real truth. He doesn't necessarily believe what it is that he's saying. So the three clips from our interviews this week, I do commend you to go back and watch all of the interviews and the full ones. We've only got clips on here. The first one was George Barris from the Institute for the Study of War, and George is talking about. The war from Putin's perspective this is phase one of what Putin is trying to do across the rest of Europe. And from Putin's perspective, he feels emboldened by what's happened in Alaska. He feels emboldened by the fact that he was front and center with Xi Jinping in China at China's big victory parades. He feels emboldened by the lack of direct action from Donald Trump in putting secondary sanctions onto Russia and elsewhere. And George, his analysis is always fantastic. He's completely right. If we don't do something to stop Putin at the moment, and we can see Putin's continuing to probe Europe with MiG-31 overflights near Estonia, with Shahad drones flying into Poland, with other drones flying and across Swedish and Danish airports and causing disruption, and we're getting other Russian missiles straying into NATO territory. Putin is looking for the political and the military reactions. And at the moment, the reactions that he's saying is he's just sitting there smiling. He's not saying anything that's really going to hurt him. So George's analysis is fantastic. I commend his interview very strongly to you.
I have some thoughts about this incursion. Look, that was an act of war, full stop. And it is not simply another incursion. This is, in my assessment, the phase zero of the Russian war against Europe. It's not helpful, I think, to categorize that sort of activity as being under the moniker of hybrid warfare. because candidly, too many Western Europeans will look at Russia's sabotage and assassinations and now air domain incursions into NATO airspace and other malfeasance and say, well, this is just sort of hybrid warfare. This is sort of just, conditions, and it's below the threshold of kinetic war. And I'm sorry, but in the Russian conception of the doctrine of how to wage warfare, the first thing that you do is the condition setting phase, and it is the psychological and political condition setting. And this drone incursion was categorically different from previous drone incursions of a much smaller scale. This is phase 0, the condition setting for the future war against Europe.
I'm really interested that you say that this was an act of war, because you've gone further than anyone else that I've spoken to about this. They're even debating whether it was an attack or not. Why do you say it is an actual act of war?
Well, to send a weapon system into an adversary's air defense system to violate their territorial and the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the airspace, and then have it be shot down by the defending country's military systems. What we had there was NATO air defense operators and NATO pilots shooting down Russian military controlled systems. It's systems on systems warfare. That was an act of war. I'm not sure if it requires any more explanation about that. It was not it was not an accident. You don't send close to 20 drones into territory for that long and that far as they did. It was an act of reconnaissance. Again, active war doesn't mean that they were going to strike. These were drones outfitted and kitted for reconnaissance mission. But to conduct a reconnaissance and penetrate an enemy air defense system and then have them be consequently shot down by fixed-wing aircraft, I mean, those are acts of war.
And Poland's foreign minister has now suggested that NATO aircraft should be authorized to shoot down drones heading its way over Ukrainian territory. And President Zelenskyy is again pushing for a no-fly zone, all extremely problematic politically. Is there any chance of this happening?
Look, let's not get wrapped around the axle, put the horse in front of the cart here. That proposal is fraught. It has benefits, it has merits, but what you're consigning the Western backers that would get involved in supporting an air defense bubble somewhere in Western or Central Ukraine is you are consigning Western forces to get involved in acts of war against the Russian Federation in the theater of Ukraine. And in principle, and in theory, that is something that you can debate the merits of. But here's the thing. If you're going to spend the political capital and increase the risk on the escalation ladder by now openly admitting that the policy is we're going to have Westerners engaged in acts of war, systems on systems warfare in Ukraine, then why culminate and end there? If you're really going to incur the risk and really own up to openly, okay, we're going to be setting ourselves up to fight the Russians, that really should happen within a larger and more robust conversation about the no kidding, bona fide security guarantees that Western European states will provide Ukraine, and not confine it simply to the air domain. So it's a risky, you acknowledge that it's politically costly. It does incur larger strategic risks. And I think it would be sort of a short stop or a half measure to simply expend the capital, the political capital and the military capital on a weak air defense bubble, when really we should be talking about more robust security guarantees. So this conversation really needs to be unpacked and put back into the larger context of, okay, what are the no kidding things that the Western European states and the United States are going to do to guarantee Ukraine's security?
And to that point, then, this launch of Operation Eastern Sentry in response to that incursion, where does that fit in exactly? And how do you think Russia is going to actually probe the deterrence effect of that?
So it's a good response that we're doing Eastern Sentry. It's a good thing that we're holding up the shields. Look, Europe needs to prepare for large-scale combat operations against the Russian Federation. I think the deterrence needs to come sooner and faster. It needs to exist beyond the air domain. We need to be talking about ground forces too, because candidly, I'll be very candid with you, Kate. There's too many, I think, NATO thinkers and too many Western European military thinkers and political scientists who entertain the hypothesis that the Russians will need 3 to 5 years to reconstitute after the war in Ukraine is over, and therefore Europe has a lot of time to think about and get its affairs in order. And I think it warrants a rigorous interrogation of an alternative hypothesis. That hypothesis is that when active fighting ends in Ukraine, Europe must be prepared no later than 12 months to be prepared to deter and unnecessary defeat conventional military operations on NATO's Eastern Front. And timeline, I think, is a lot less favorable. And I'm prepared to argue for why that's the case. But it's good. But we really need to get much more serious about this in all domains: land domain, cyber, information warfare.
So our next clip is from Michael Basirkov, who's a Ukrainian journalist, a Canadian Ukrainian journalist, but he lives in Ukraine. But he was talking to Louis Sykes from the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and he brings up some very interesting points. You know, the one of the most interesting ones I find is him talking about how Ukrainians are now helping train the Poles in using drones as potential interceptors because of the threat of Russian drones coming into Poland. And he goes on to say, who'd have thought that the Ukrainians once relied on NATO nations coming in and helping to train them. Now the Ukrainians, who are probably one of the most experienced and powerful militaries in the world, are going out and training their NATO neighbours in trying to counter the Russian threat. Before that, Michael puts into perspective the NATO response to the Russian threat and effectively describes Article 4, which has been called twice in the past 10 days as, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm putting it in my own language, a collective stiff letter and collective finger waggling rather than something that Putin is going to sit up and listen to and suggest that NATO needs to be more decisive in its actions as well. But he goes on to talk about how Ukraine is having greater success at attacking Russian infrastructure and talks a little bit about what's going on the front line and how drones are impacting the front line and how Russia is still innovating in what's going on. So an interesting interview covering an awful lot of ground. Michael is always well worth going and listening to.
There's one thing everyone needs to understand, right? Is that words don't matter when it comes to trying to push Russia back, when it's, trying to scare Vladimir Putin. Words don't scare him. And I think what's happening, in fact, I'm in New York at the UNGA, and we just had a discussion this morning about what it takes to push back the bad guys. And there's a feeling that not only is the rules-based international order in a free fall, that autocrats or bad guys or non-state actors are ignoring humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, all of these tools that we all once depended on to have a free and fair world. A lot of that is gone. Thank God there's things like the International Court of Justice and so on. But I think over the years, NATO has become very complacent. Yes, they're going to go into Ukraine. Maybe they're going to the Baltic states, but they're never going to mess with, let's call it mainland NATO territory on the eastern flank, the Polands of the world or Germany. So it is happening. And I think basically two reasons here. One is, as you've heard me say multiple times previously, no solid red lines policed by the United States anymore. At best, they're dotted lines or they're gray lines. And the other thing, what is happening is this is Mr. Putin testing, probing how far we can do. After all, that's what autocrats do. And I think that if they're doing these incursions, especially the 3 MiG fighter jets over Estonia, this order came from up high. Probably Vladimir Putin himself signed off on it, which is very worrisome. And then the other thing is this was premeditated. This was not a scheduled, series of flights that the Russian claimed. So these are very, very dangerous times. And, triggering Article 4 consultations, now we've seen it done twice by Poland, now by Estonia. Putting more kit in the air that doesn't really match the threat. These are very troubling times indeed because of all that.
And Ukraine is now offering to train Polish soldiers to use interceptor drones. That could that kind of low-cost low-risk way of stopping Russian drones de-escalate this threat in and of itself, or does NATO need to step up here?
Well, my friend, I'm smiling because who would have thought we would have got to the day where you have Ukrainians offering to train NATO about how to bring down Russian drones, which we must, if anyone needs any reminding, there's also technology in there from Iran and also China. But yeah, the Ukrainians have built up a huge body of knowledge, of experience. They're the most experienced fighting force we have in the modern world right now when it comes to fighting off not only the kinetic warfare, but the hybrid warfare and the tech warfare, that they are in a good position. And, you know, they have really cool methods. They don't tell us everything, but part of it is GPS jamming. It's using electronic warfare to confuse these drones. It's also using a number of things in the air that they don't talk about much, decoy drones. The Russians are fighting back hard. They're also using all kinds of different techniques. I looked at the map the other day of the latest Russian wave of drones. I think they're about 300 to 350, and it looked like a piece of artwork when you look at the map. They use these circuitous paths to confuse the Ukrainians. But let there be no doubt is that whatever has been thrown back at the Russians so far, because of the mass of drones that are being sent over, it's very, very difficult for any fighting force, no matter how experienced, no matter how advanced, to fight them off. But again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. At the beginning of the war, yes, you did have NATO forces, including Canada, training Ukrainians, first in Western Ukraine, now outside their borders. And now it could work the other way around. I mean, I wrote the other day in World Briefing, the way the Poles and NATO responded to that Russian incursion was like firing a cannon at a canoe. You know, it was really an expensive, ineffective way to fight back with these small, cheap devices. So they're going to have to learn very fast, and who better than the Ukrainians? It's very difficult to get a proper fix on what exactly is happening at the front line, because it does seem that one day the Ukrainians are taking credit for significant advances, and then the next day the Russians do exactly the same thing. But if you look at the more general trends that we've been seeing for the past few weeks, is the Russians have been devoting quite a bit of manpower, quite a bit of firepower to getting control of those very crucial elevated pieces of land, those strategic cities in the Donbass where they can make further advances, Konstantinovka, places like that, Pokrovsk. There's also talk of a bigger Russian buildup around the areas of Kharkiv and Sumy. And my goodness, they sure seem to have an endless supply of drones and also missiles. But in terms of Ukraine striking legitimate military targets inside of Russia, for example, the oil refineries, they're doing an amazing job, to the point where there are significant shortages being reported in the pro-Kremlin media. And we're talking about front page stuff about long lineups at gas pumps. And right now it's the harvest season. And if agricultural machinery can't fuel up to harvest the fields, that's a big, big problem. Most of the shortages are being reported in more remote regions, but don't be surprised if this continues, that you're going to see shortages in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and elsewhere. The other thing the Ukrainians have not given up on is further degrading the Russians' Black Sea Fleet. I think there is a development over the past couple of days where they hit quite hard there. So it's on a number of fronts. And again, this is not really that much due to Western technology or manpower. This is homegrown stuff, drones that have a lot of range and pack a lot of firepower to really hit Russia where it hurts. But most importantly, to bring this war to the doorsteps of ordinary Russians. They seem to be doing very well on that front.
And our final video that I want to point you out this week is with my old friend and colleague, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon.
I was seeing a report yesterday, the day before, of them taking out some of the key air defence radars in Crimea. I mean, that is exactly what they should be doing.
Oh, the Kerch Bridge is next, almost certainly. They're clearing a path to get to there.
Absolutely. I mean, you'll know better than I. You know, the whole intelligence, shaping the intelligence battlefield, and really degrading behind the Russian front line. So, yeah, it is vital, and the fact that they now have the capability to do it is great. It sort of suggests to me that American intelligence is still, you know, on full tap, as it were, which was great and absolutely how it should be. But their deep strikes into Russia, really, you know, from the Mark I of Operation Spider's Web, attacking destroying the strategic nuclear jets, to attacking the oil refineries, which, you know, it depends who you listen to, but, you know, an average figure seems to be that they've destroyed about 20% of Russia's ability to refine and produce fuel, and a lot of it for domestic consumption. And you don't have to look deep into social media to see massive queues of cars trying to get fuel, and that's if there is any fuel available. Even I understand in St. Petersburg, you know, it's very difficult to get fuel. And, you know, this is really, not only is it cutting off the sort of foreign currency of selling all this stuff outside Russia, but actually it's really beginning to hit the rank and file. And I think that's really clever, because it is the rank and file at the moment who seem to be the only ones who might have an influence on what Putin and the Kremlin does next. And one can, you know, again, one doesn't want half back to Afghanistan, but when things went really bad for the Russians there in the 80s, it was actually the people who got the government to change. Now, very different type of leadership now than it was then. But having said that, it's exactly what they should be doing. You know, they're playing to their strengths. They don't have, you know, the 600, 700,000 soldiers to put into the front line to face up. But what they do have, it seems to me, you know, a really well-oiled and trained and motivated special operations executive, whatever we want to call it, doing some really, having a strategic impact by some of the attacks that they're doing. And on the oil industry, it seems to make a hell of a lot of sense. And not only just that, but, you know, drones in Moscow last night, we understand, you know, the airport is only just opening now. And again, that is hitting your average Russian who's still trying to get somewhere for a bit of a, you know, last minute summer holiday. So, yeah, what they're doing there is really impressive, and will probably have more impact than a lot of other things that they might be doing.
And you know, Hamish is talking about the impact of the long-range strikes that there are across Russia, and, you know, Ukraine building its own indigenous long-range strike capability, and the fact that that's impacting the fuel depots. And the fuel depots are there that are not just affecting the Russian public, but also affecting Russia's ability to continue to supply the fuel to the front line that's needed, and how that, from a military perspective, is attacking this operational level of war. And it's that operational level of war that is the bit that enables the tactical fight to happen. So the more that goes on, the greater the impact it'll have in the front line. But again, goes on to discuss the fact that, you know, this is still going to take time to have an effect. The biggest effect is the fact that the war is being brought home to the Russian people, as we see fuel shortages increasingly across Russia, and that is something that Vladimir Putin is most concerned about. So those are the videos that we have for our recap this week. Again, please go back and watch everything on our YouTube channel, and sign up for Times Radio membership, because that'll give you access to exclusive content before anyone else. And then you can put your questions underneath it, or your points underneath it, for me to answer in our weekly question and answer. And of course, you can get access to Times Radio Frontline on your favourite podcast channel. Just go onto that channel and search for Times Radio Frontline. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Goodbye.